Well, good morning and to everyone, and thank you for attending our second session of Tax 101. Today, we're going to talk about Nebraska's competitive status from a tax standpoint. I'm Bryan Slone, president of the Chamber, and for those of you who are on the first of this three-part series, and those who were not, just a quick refresher. In our last session, we went through the actual complexity of Nebraska's taxes, where over only about half of our taxes in our general fund are used to fund state and local government. The other is all local government. And so we have this complex system, which has resulted in a fairly uncompetitive tax rate. But I want to put this in perspective first. Nebraska ranks high in many areas, and we all know that in terms of the good life that is here. So you take a look at Nebraska: best place to retire, #1; lowest unemployment, #2; housing affordability, #4; best state to find a job, #4; fastest commute times, which for those of us who've lived in other states, fastest commute time is a big deal. Children's economic well-being. It's a great place for families to raise children. High school graduation rate, educational attainment in Nebraska is great. Volunteerism, and I'd put in there philanthropy, is unbelievable in this state. And overall affordability of this state, #6. You take a look at those statistics and you would think people would be moving here in the droves. It really is, and we all know it, the greatest place to live in the United States. There really isn't a second that's that close. And I think coming out of the pandemic, we're going to see that these issues are even more important. Now, I'm obviously the president of the Nebraska Chamber, so I'm biased, but these are incredible statistics that any state would love to have. The issues that we struggle with in terms of attracting people, though, and this is just personal opinion, but I think it's reflected in the Blueprint Nebraska report, are really four. It is, one, perceptions about our weather, and Nebraska as a very cold and very hot state. I want to come back to that as it affects economic growth, because I absolutely believe it's a red herring. Out of all these four issues, it's the only one we can't control, which is our weather. But I absolutely think it's a red herring based on what we're seeing in other states, growing states at this point. The second issue is, like many other places, changes in our economy, and particularly changes to an internet economy, really affected our downtowns in the last 20 years. And, you know, what we've learned over the last couple of decades is our downtowns are still the front door to attracting population to our communities. And you can see it in terms of the redevelopment that occurred in urban areas like Omaha and Lincoln, in the Old Market, Haymarket, as an example, and the changes that really made for those two communities. But it's also true in our smaller communities. You take communities like Broken Bow and what they did with their downtown, and in fact, like the entire community was very impressive and has had an effect. I would argue that my favorite town of Pender has done that as well. But, you know, you look at the plants in Norfolk right now and what they're doing up there, couldn't be more exciting. North Platte feels the same way. All over the state, you can see this. This is eminently fixable. Down on the bottom left, how we market this state. Nebraska, honestly, it's not for everyone. I'm sorry, that's incredibly fixable. And it's time to be done with that. And it's a lesson in marketing, and, you know, nobody should take this from an accountant. But from a marketing standpoint, what I learned long ago is external marketing also affects internal marketing. And while I realized this was the Tourism Bureau and it was catchy trying to attract tourism, it's really important for both internal and external marketing that we be coordinated in a brand that really puts Nebraska in its best light. But our subject of the day, and the fourth big issue in terms of attracting jobs and people and companies and retaining them in this state, is taxes. And that's the whole point of these series. we will come back to some of these other issues that are reflected in the Blueprint report in other series. But for now, I want to talk about taxes and its effect in terms of our competitive ability to attract both jobs and people to our state, and just give you some data points. And then in the third session of this later this month, we'll talk about tax modernization and what alternatives are out there, and also compared to some other states and what they're thinking about or doing right now. So let's take a look at Nebraska's taxes. And the obvious that everybody talks about and we all know is property taxes. From a property tax standpoint, you see the best states on the left, many of them high growing states, not all, but many of them high growth states. And then you look at the map on the right and you see where we are. Nebraska is number 41. That means there's only 9 states in the country that have higher property tax ratings based on Tax Foundation than we do. And when you look at those are the dark brown states. So that's Illinois, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, DC. Other than Illinois and that East Coast extremely urban area, we're higher than everybody else. And so when people complain about property taxes in Nebraska, it's not without reason. And property taxes have an effect, certainly when we're trying to attract not only businesses, but people to the state. And they look at the cost of property taxes in our state versus other states. Now you look around us, in the immediate proximity, it's not quite that bad. It's because you look at Wyoming at 39, Colorado at 32, Iowa at 38, Kansas at 30. But when we're competing for people and jobs and movement of people with places like, take a look at Indiana and Ohio, number 2 and number 6, Utah, number 7, Idaho, number 3, New Mexico, number 1, Arizona, which is increasingly a place that people are going to, is number 11. Even California is number 14. And certainly Washington and Oregon, which are high growth states right now, number 18, number 16. When we take it in the big picture, property taxes are hurting us pretty significantly from a competitive standpoint. Let's just turn, well, you would assume with high property taxes, then we must be really competitive in sales taxes and income taxes. And the truth is no, we're not as competitive as we need to be in both sales and income taxes as well. From a sales tax standpoint, you'll see in the map on the left that we rank number 29. And that puts us in the bottom half. In other words, there are 21 states worse than us from a sales tax rate standpoint. But that means there's 28 that are better. So we're not even at the midpoint in sales taxes in terms of the rates we charge. If you look at the states with the highest sales tax rates, again, there's some around us, certainly Kansas at 8.69%, even South Dakota at 6.4 and Iowa at 6.94, pretty close, Missouri at 8.25, 8.69, Colorado at 7.72. Again, compared to the states immediately around us, which is really important with sales taxes, because with sales taxes and transaction taxes, people can move very quickly and move their transactions very quickly. And so it's important that we always stay competitive and ideally just a little bit under our neighboring states. So if we look at it solely from a neighboring state standpoint, we're in decent shape in sales taxes, but not great, but we're in decent shape. But then again, you turn to some of the other states, and again, you're going to find the Utahs we're competitive with, but not the Oregons, and not some of the other states that are much lower. But for sales taxes, we're much more competitive. So if I turn to income taxes, we're going to see a different story. Well, in sales taxes, we're fairly competitive, sort of in the middle. From an income tax standpoint, at our individual rate of 6.84%, we're a high tax state. And you can see on the map that as those colors get darker, that the tax rates go up. And so you see places like California at 13.3% is the highest. Obviously not where you want to go. The Iowa rate, I want to note, Iowa historically has had a deduction for federal taxes, so their rate is a little different than everybody else's. But at 6.84, we're substantially higher than Colorado, extremely much higher than Wyoming and South Dakota, our neighbors, which are 0. All things considered, about even with Iowa when you take their deduction scheme, and then higher than Kansas and Missouri. And so from an income tax standpoint, we're actually one of the highest arguably the highest in our region, with maybe Iowa being a comparable. And then as you go on, again, I'll take a state that's a high growth state. Let's take a Utah or North Carolina. Utah is at a 4.95% rate, and South Carolina is at a 7.0%, or North Carolina is at a 5.25%. Very high growth states. Virginia at 5.75 is very high growth. Look at Indiana, a very similar state in terms of makeup of ag and manufacturing, and they're at 3.23%. North Dakota at 2.90%. So we're on the high end of individual income taxes. Interestingly, the number of states that have no income tax at all is pretty significant compared to sales taxes or even property taxes. The numbers, we've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tax states with no income tax, including Florida and Texas, which tends to drive a lot of population choices. But also the state of Washington, which is a very high growth state at this point, and South Dakota. So if you're looking on a city basis, actually within the Midwest region, one of the fastest growing cities, and indeed growing faster than a lot, if not all of Nebraska communities, is Sioux Falls. And much of that relates directly to being a no tax state. In addition to no tax states, we have a lot of flat income tax states, meaning that basically, and they're not always a pure flat income tax state, but basically a single rate on income. And places like Colorado at 4.55 or Utah at 4.95. When people or companies take a look at the cost of doing business or the cost of living in a state, they tend to focus on the rate, not all the individual deductions. And so Colorado and Utah look very appealing. Utah is particularly has made distinct efforts to get down in the 4-point range, which they view as competitive. They're continuing to try to lower that tax again this year. So my expectation is Utah's number will go down, and indeed Utah is one of the fastest growing states in the country. So if I take a look at property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes, we're very uncompetitive on property, sort of middle of the road on sales taxes, but similar to our states around us, and on income taxes, very high again. And it's a differentiator between us and high growth states. What's important about this individual income tax rate is to remember that the bulk of small businesses anymore are LLCs and partnerships, flow through organizations that are taxed on individual income tax returns, not corporate tax returns. So this rate differential is very important, not only for individuals, but for attracting small businesses and medium-sized businesses and the growth that goes with that. But what I don't want to leave out is something that's really, really important, and that I don't think gets focused on very much. The state and local tax burdens by state also relate to corporate income taxes. And at a corporate level, we have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the country. Again, we're number 19, meaning that we're higher than all but 30. We're higher than 31 of the states. And that 10.3%, if you look at our actual corporate rate, that's not our actual corporate rate, but that takes into account certain things that we're not allowed to deduct and other provisions of our corporate tax code. We're a very high corporate tax rate state, and in fact, our corporate taxes in the last decade have grown much faster than our property income or sales tax, individual sales income taxes. And this corporate tax issue is going to become a much bigger issue potentially in the future based on what happens on federal tax level. And it's something that the state has to be very, very much aware of. So the chart on the left shows that this is the US effective rate on corporate income on the federal taxes versus other OECD countries around the world, major trading partners. And what you'll see is the United States appears twice, once in 2017 before the Trump corporate tax reduction, where we were basically the highest average corporate tax rate anywhere. It was the whole point behind the Trump corporate income tax rate reduction, was to make us competitive globally. The post-Trump number, 2019, is now the effective rate is 24.60. Again, that's the actual rate is not 24.60, but the effective rate is because of certain deductions that aren't allowed in the United States. Remember that much of this corporate rate reduction that was in the Trump bill was paid for by other business offsets, either deductions or exclusions that were denied or timing differences that were changed in that bill. Even after the Trump bill, we were sort of, as a country, middle of the pack, and you take, but at least we were lower than, major trading partners like Germany, Japan, Mexico, Canada, and that was really important. Obviously, what's being talked about now in Washington is the potential for walking back those Trump corporate tax rate reductions, even partially to, let's say, something like 26 or 28%, adding another 5% to the corporate tax rate. What you could see here is if I just did simple math, that would take us back up to 29.6, let's say a 5% increase. And that would put us at a much higher corporate rate on a federal level than places like Germany, Japan, Mexico, Canada. And likely what you would see is a shift, or at least make us less competitive in keeping companies in the United States and attracting companies to the United States. What it would do on the state side, and this is really a state discussion, is suddenly companies would be adding their state and federal taxes in the US when they're making decisions of whether they're going to, let's say, manufacture something in Mexico or Canada or Japan or wherever. And the state corporate tax number would come into that. And so if there's an increase in the federal rate, what I would presume is going to happen is this state corporate rate is now going to become a much bigger issue in terms of the competitiveness of the state to retain and attract corporations to that state. Therein, a raise in the US corporate rate combined with our current corporate tax rates would make it very difficult for us to compete, and it would continue to highlight and at a much greater level highlight our state rate issue. So let me then turn to fastest growing economies by GDP. So, and this is changing almost monthly during the pandemic. So don't hold this chart to be exact on any given month, but generally speaking, and these are states that are high growth states. If you look down the East Coast, Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Florida. Now, Texas is always obviously a high growth state as well, but there's been this shift in particularly just the last couple of years where places like Utah and Idaho and Colorado and Oregon and Washington are dramatically changing their portfolio in terms of how they rate in GDP growth. They're really at the high end of this at this point. And traditionally, it's been places like California and Florida and Texas that were the high growth states. And that always led to the supposition that, well, it's weather. Obviously, they have an advantage because of weather. If you've lived in Oregon and if you've lived in the state of Washington, it's not weather. They don't have the weather we do. And And so you ask yourself, what's driving it? Well, one of the things you see here for all these states, their tax rankings are just to the right. The only overall tax rankings, the only one that is in the bottom half is Washington. But one thing that's pretty consistent with GDP growth, and there's a number of studies out there that have shown this, that the GDP growth is largely, not 100% of the time, but most of the time related to where you fit in these tax rankings. You take a state like Utah at 7th, growing by leaps and bounds. Idaho suddenly is booming. It's 8th. And our neighboring state of Colorado is in that boat as well. So taxes matter. Taxes are a big factor in GDP growth and where we go. And one of the issues that we're just gonna have to get to the bottom of is that the only way to fix our tax system ultimately is not to just continue to shift taxes or to raise one and lower another, but to actually do better at GDP growth and build a tax system that encourages GDP growth and gets us higher up these rankings. And that will be a discussion we'll have in the final segment later this month. There's one other issue that I want to talk about. We're level setting for that discussion we're going to have at the end of the month. When you look at corporate tax systems within the states, one of the other things that never gets talked about but should get talked about is tax administration. How competitive is our tax administration system? Meaning how competitive is the way we enforce and administer our tax system versus other states? There's a huge advantage in being a piggyback system, which means we basically use the federal system and just apply state rates. By keeping it simple, that keeps the compliance very simple and the planning very simple for both individuals and companies. And so then it only becomes a sales tax and property tax issue. The more that we divorce ourselves from that federal system, the more complicated it gets and oftentimes more difficult the tax administration, because now we have to have a lot more individual audits of issues here and everything that comes with them. The other piece of tax administration, particularly for businesses, is how easy is it to comply with the law and how easy is it to resolve controversies when they do occur. Many of you know that earlier in my career, I had a chance to be the commissioner's lawyer at the IRS, and I worked for a commissioner by the name of Larry Gibbs. Larry was a commissioner of the IRS during the Reagan administration, and his view was that tax administration means that you treat taxpayers like customers, and that the goal has to be first and foremost to make compliance easy so you don't have lots of conflicts. And then once you do have any conflicts, if you truly have taxpayers who are intentionally trying not to comply, then you absolutely run them through the enforcement process. But if you have taxpayers who were honestly trying to comply, but the system was simply too complex, then you create mechanisms to resolve those controversies very simply, easily, and fairly. In the IRS system, there's very clear distinctions between the commissioner's role and the counsel roles. There is an independent appeals office that resolves cases on hazards of litigation that's independent largely from the litigation positions of that agency. There's legislative oversight committees, and there's a huge taxpayer service group and a taxpayer advocate with broad capabilities and to resolve taxpayers' matters when they just get stuck in a system. So one of the things that we'll talk about in the third series in terms of being competitive is not only our rates, but how we enforce our tax system and what we could do to become really the number one tax administration system, the easiest places for taxpayers to comply and to resolve their controversies. And so with that, I'll go to questions, and you'll have to pardon my dress today. It's most people who know me know I'm a suit and tie guy, but I am getting my second shot after this, and so I'm in casual dress today. So I'll get my second vaccine today, and hope you were all doing the same. So let me take a look at some questions and see what we've got out there. The question is, does Nebraska shift to market state apportionment ease the impact of the state corporate income tax for corporations that are located here? In other words, is much of this tax being paid by corporations largely located elsewhere? To some extent, although Matt, the largest increase in corporate taxes in the last few years has actually been the foreign source income, the failure to change our state system after the Trump bill, where we're a singular outlier in how we tax foreign income of corporations. That number is the largest, and that needs to be fixed because it really makes it difficult to attract multinationals after this. To one of my good friends who says, "Are you playing golf after this vaccine?" The answer is no. Oh, how I wish. Do we have an idea of how much money in taxes we are not collecting that we should be paying? By being a piggyback system, you're generally more efficient on that than other systems. There is cheating, obviously, in the United States, but that number is relatively small. We have the most compliant system in the world, which is why I think having a piggyback system makes it easy, because if we can reach the compliance rates of the federal government, we're doing good. How are we doing with digital and e-commerce tax issues? I would say we're doing great. You have to commend both the legislature and the governor for passing our taxation of e-commerce 2 or 3 years ago now. That was a big deal during this pandemic as the market shifted to a lot of internet sales and really saved our revenues during that period of time. We have a question. I think our sales tax, or a comment, I think our sales tax system has too many gray areas for small businesses, particularly around ag and services. I would tend to agree. I think one of the things I certainly learned when I was at the IRS was, if you're going to go about making a tax system easy to comply with, and what you see is when you make it easy to comply with, you get better compliance and less non-payment. You have to have some pretty clear definitions, and what I'm hoping that when we talk at the end of the month, we'll talk about simplicity. If we were to rewrite the state's tax code, how would we do it so it would be more straightforward? And so with that, I think I've exceeded my time limit today. I hope this is helpful. This is all in preparation for a discussion that I hope you'll join us at the end of the month on. And so what are models for tax modernization? We're not going to pitch a particular approach, but just to give everybody a background of what other states are doing, what the alternatives are, so that as this debate ensues next year, everybody's kind of on that same level playing field. So thank you for joining us. And by the time we meet at the end of the month, and I've had my second vaccine for a few weeks, I will proclaim myself invincible, and it'll be a good effort. So thanks, gang. Really appreciate it.